This is Keys to the Shop, episode 350. Today we're talking about the physics of filter coffee with Jonathan Gagné. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show, and I am, as ever, thankful that you decided to tune in today. If you're new to the show, welcome. Well, if you're not new to the show, welcome to you as well. Thank you so much for being a listener all of these years. And especially to those of you who are new to the show, you know, there's a lot of episodes to Keys to the Shop. And one of the great ways that you can sort of get started with the episodes is going to the website keystotheshop.com and use the search bar in the upper right-hand corner, and that'll let you search by topic the things that you're interested in listening to from the catalog of all the past episodes of Keys to the Shop, which it's been about 5.5 years now, and we've got hundreds of episodes, and there's a very good chance that we've covered something that you've been wondering about. So I want to encourage you to do that. And for everybody out there listening, it would be great if you would subscribe to the show. Just hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening to this podcast, and absolutely share these episodes with a friend. So thanks everyone very much for doing that. Now, one of the ways I like to help people in coffee, besides producing this podcast, is also through consulting. So Keys to the Shop Consulting is where I get to work directly with you to help you take your operations, quality, and people to the next level in your coffee shop. Whether you're just starting out and need an advisor to walk with you from concept to opening day, or you're already established, but you know that you need to solve some problems, need some help with projects, you want to scale your business, or you just want to refine and improve what you already have, working with Keys to the Shop Consulting, either remotely or on site, might be the right solution for you. I'd love to have a conversation with you. Just email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. We'll set up a free discovery call and talk more in detail about what you've got going on and see how I might be able to help you. Again, that email for Keys to the Shop Consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. Brewing great coffee is what we're talking about today. Of course, this is a topic that we always are focusing on in coffee. And one of the things that you need in order to brew coffee is some equipment. And if you're brewing batch brew coffee, you want to make sure that you're getting something that is designed to maximize the flavor of your coffee and do it consistently. Those two things are really what make specialty coffee stand out. The consistency, the quality, and no machine delivers better on those two things than the ground control Cyclops brewer from Voga Coffee. The SCA award-winning technology in this brewer allows you unprecedented control over a range of flavors in your coffee that previously were just impossible to really tap into. And not only is this a next-level batch brewer, but it also makes tea, batched iced lattes, batched cold brew. So check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee. Find out more about this wonderful piece of equipment. And if you're looking for efficiency, maximum quality, and serving your customers the absolute best, then I think you really should consider getting a ground control Cyclops brewer for your cafe. To find out more information, again, check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee. Now, as any of us know, the ability for us to make great coffee is going to have to be matched by our ability to combine that coffee with quality ingredients based on what the customer's ordered. When it comes to milk beverages, you know, we want to source great dairy milk, but when it comes to plant-based beverages, that's absolutely one of those categories that in many cases outperforms dairy milk. It's just not slowing down. And that's why companies like Pacific and their Barista series are so crucial. The Barista series is the line of plant-based performance beverages that is designed for baristas and approved by baristas all over the world. It is literally tested by competition-level baristas to make sure that it performs on the bar the way that it should. It stands up to the heat from steaming, produces amazing texture for latte art, and most importantly, it balances in flavor with your coffee. So the coffee is always the star. So you should go to pacificfoodservice.com to find out more information about the Barista Series, get samples in your store, and try it for yourself. I think you'll be impressed, and so will your customers. If you want to serve the best plant-based beverages around, then I believe you need to be serving the Barista Series from Pacific. Now, today we are graced by the presence of someone whose scientific rigor and curiosity has been in full display on his Instagram account and his blog, and now in the book, The Physics of Filter Coffee. We're talking with Jonathan Gagné. Now, Jonathan Gagné is a scientific advisor at the Rio Tinto Alcan Planetarium in Montreal and is an adjunct professor at the University of Montreal. He completed his Ph.D. in astrophysics in 2015 and moved to the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, D.C. for his postdoc as a Sagan Fellow. He came back to Montreal to start a second postdoctorate at the Institute of Research of Exoplanets before he was hired by the planetarium. Now, Jonathan's expertise is focused on brown dwarfs, young stars, exoplanets, and stellar associations. He uses various telescopes throughout the world to carry out his research. In his free time, Jonathan is also passionate about coffee brewing. That might be a little bit of an understatement, really, and has dived deeply into all the many aspects of how physics affect coffee preparation for pour-overs and, more recently, espresso. He maintains a blog of his findings and understandings of coffee physics at coffeeadastra.com, and he is the author of this new book, The Physics of Filter Coffee, which is what we're going to be talking with him about today. And of course, as you might expect from somebody with his background in science and expertise, applying this kind of understanding to coffee surfaces a lot of great insights for how we in the coffee industry, who may not have this scientific background, can more accurately understand what's going on in the brewing process to make us better at delivering consistency and quality in our brews. And in this conversation today, we'll be talking about applying physics to how water moves through coffee, building and refining how you experiment with coffee yourself, some of his main findings that impact the quality of your brews at home and in the coffee shop, as we talk about batch brewing, different tools that you can use to assess the quality of your coffee that really deliver. We discuss coffee freshness, various roast levels, water quality, and lots of different recommendations from Jonathan about how you can brew great coffee. Of course, this conversation, we cover a good range of things, but it's not even the tip of the iceberg of what you're going to read in his book. But I'm really glad to have had Jonathan on the show to talk about this subject. I found the conversation very enriching, and I hope you do too. So let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation about the physics of filter coffee with Jonathan Gagné. Well, Jonathan, welcome to Keys to the Shop. Excited to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm very good. How about you?
I'm doing absolutely fantastic, actually. And I'm excited to talk to you, especially because your book, The Physics of Filter Coffee, is taking off. And it is in no small part, I think, because there is a real hunger for actual science and scientific rigor in what we claim as true about coffee. We have a lot of, I think the term that gets used a lot here is pocket science, because we're coffee professionals that try to become scientists retroactively, because nobly, we want to understand coffee better. And so we try to understand the scientific, but it's different when someone like yourself, who has a deep expertise in science, comes along and then applies it to coffee. And so this is definitely going to be a wealth of knowledge, I think, today. So I guess I just am interested first how you began your coffee journey, specifically into applying physics to coffee. How did this all start for you?
Yeah, so I was also very surprised at the level of interest that there was in using hard science to better understand filter coffee or espresso even. And at first, I didn't just apply physics to coffee for the sake of using physics. It was rather because I was becoming dissatisfied with the fact that my pour-over brews would taste very different from one day to the next, or as I was traveling. So during my PhD and the subsequent postdocs, I was traveling a lot across the world, and I would brew one or two pour-overs every day without really knowing the details of the physics or the chemistry, or even without measuring very carefully my variables. And as time went on, I had a few very, very good brews that I wasn't able to replicate. So when I came back to Montreal, my brews were suddenly much worse, and I did not understand why. So I started searching on the web for explanations about what can affect the taste of pour-over coffee and how we can control it, and why my brews might be tasting worse all of a sudden. And I found some information that was written by Scott Rao, which I found super useful. But I also realized that a lot of the explanations that I could find on forums or on the internet at large were not really based on solid grounds of physics or chemistry, and rather were based on experience and subjective tasting. And as a consequence, only those such as Scott, who had an immense amount of experience, were able to formulate recommendations more clearly. So I thought it would be useful to actually try to help us to navigate how we can better craft coffee recipes by really understanding what is happening inside of the coffee bed as water is flowing through it. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to just read up everything I could on the internet about it, try to formulate a mental model of how the water is flowing, what is happening. And I did not realize that it would gather that much traffic. And a lot of people that were not scientists started contacting me and telling me that they found this super useful. So that's how I decided to really dig deeper into the topic and write a bit more about it and try to popularize the physics under coffee. And I was also discovering a lot while I was researching this that I didn't understand at all at first. One of the things that I discovered was that the reason why my brews tasted much worse when I moved back in Montreal was related to the bicarbonate amount in water, in the Montreal tap water. So it just happened that the tap water in Washington, D.C. was pretty good for coffee. It's in the SCA recommended region, for example. And the amount of bicarbonate in Montreal water is about twice as much, which really reduces the perceived acidity in coffee, which I really seek in specialty coffee. That gives it some fruity notes or more floral notes. And it really makes it a lot duller, a lot more boring.
When you started to put all of your information out there and really pursue this as a journal, which is essentially like a live journal of your exploration of coffee, and you got this response from the coffee community, you had previously only wanted to make better coffee for yourself, and now you're fielding questions that people have about coffee, and I'm imagining that those questions also helped you know or just figure out what to pursue next in coffee based on what the industry was saying. Hey, while you're at it, maybe you can look into this or that. Was there some of the kind of co-creative element in the blogging that helped direct some of your research?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really pushed me to keep going is realizing that we had not really explored all of the possibilities, in part because we didn't understand the reasons why certain things would taste better or worse than other things. So we have so many things we can control when we brew coffee, whether it be filter or espresso. It's almost impossible to try everything. And this means that there might be some combinations of parameters when we brew coffee that would taste way better but we just haven't tried them yet because no one has tried this particular brew temperature with this particular grind size, with this particular dripper design, for example. And realizing that there might be some hidden recipes that would taste really, really great, it really pushed me to explore deeper, to understand all of the aspects of brewing coffee, from the paper filters we use to the geometry of the drippers to the water composition and how extraction happens, what a grinder can do to your brews. And all of that is, each of these aspects are actually rabbit holes of their own, and they're very complicated and deep topics. So it's just extremely interesting, as well as it will help us to really just brew better coffee. So there was definitely a back and forth with the community, those that had some experience and specific questions about, for example, why does that type of water taste worse? And one important thing to note is that I'm not a chemist, and a lot of information that's very useful for brewing coffee is actually related to chemistry. And there's also some considerations of biology because coffee is a plant. This is also another aspect I have very little specialization in. The aspects that I was able to tackle the most efficiently was how water flows through the coffee and how that affects how different compounds extract from the coffee particles and how it's affected by particle size, particle shapes. And even for that, I had to do a lot of research, mostly in geophysics, because they often want to know how fluids propagate through soil, for example, or even oil fracking, because you are yet again moving a fluid through a porous medium. And I really had to do a lot of readings in ancillary fields of physics that I'm not specialized in. So the skills that I had that I could really most directly apply to brewing coffee or carrying out kitchen experiments was really the scientific mindset. So controlling all variables except one and seeing what happens, and some bases in statistics, what makes a measurement good or bad, what type of things can bias any measurements you make about coffee, and some programming. So I've learned to code in many different programming languages. So all of these skills I had learned in programming turned out to be super useful to analyze the data, plot the results, and making visualization to better understand what was going on. And those were really the skills that were most directly applicable to coffee. And all of the other skills, like understanding the geophysics of how water flows through a porous medium, I really had to do some reading and some learning on my own to understand this better.
That's really fascinating. And I was just thinking about fluid dynamics modeling, where, you could use, like Boeing uses that for jet engines and things where, but they're dealing with known entities that aren't so biological, in a sense, like they're just the way they are. Mostly in coffee, it seems to me, is this thing that changes based on how you roast it or where it comes from. Is there complication in plotting like predictable paths of the fluid, of water going through coffee, based on just the fact that it's an agricultural product that changes and it's not just this stable entity you can create rules around?
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned roast level. If you roast darker, the oils inside coffee particles will come out at the surface much faster. And these oils can interact with the flow of water. You have a CO2 degassing. If a coffee ages, it's going to have less CO2 that is left in the particles for degassing. So if you make espresso, for example, you are pressurizing water to force it to go through a puck of coffee. But this coffee is degassing, there's oil, there's potentially channels where water can flow faster. And a lot of the literature on geophysics assumes that the porous medium you are using is never changing. The particles are not moving around, and they're not degassing. They're not behaving in all the weird ways that particles of coffee behave. So you really have to take all of the predictions from simplified geophysics laws with a grain of salt, and always remember that different, more complicated things can happen. And it definitely complicates the interpretation. However, it's always very useful to start from simplifying assumptions and see how your observations deviate from what the theory would predict, and use basically Occam's razor and try to hypothesize what could be happening with my coffee for my observations to deviate from the predictions that the theory is making. And this is an incremental way to really better understand what is going on and refine your mental model, and start exploring all of the complicated ways in which coffee is behaving. So basically, one example where having a good model of the physics of how water flows through a puck can be helpful would be, for example, if you notice dark spots under the puck, you might realize that those are regions where water was not flowing very efficiently. So you left some soluble materials there that you could have extracted. And if you understand the physics well, it can help you make predictions on how you might fix that particular problem. So at first, when I started learning about how water flows through coffee, most of my predictions turned out to be wrong. When I made a prediction, for example, on how to make a brew less sour, less astringent, most of the time coffee surprised me, and I tried something and the results were super counterintuitive. And it took at least a year or two of exploring how coffee behaves to really start getting a better understanding that was complex enough that I could make predictions that actually worked. So it's really, it can seem like a simple thing, just brewing a cup of coffee. But if you dig deep enough, most things in life that appear simple are actually very complicated.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I can see how that'd be true for a lot of different things. And with coffee,
Mhm.
you mentioned earlier how there is a rabbit hole in each of the variables
Yeah.
that you have in coffee. And I was even thinking that, the different roasters and machines, roast levels and innovations that we do as companies and roasteries and manufacturing that are all meant to try to make coffee better, introduce a whole nother set of variables that seems to be making it harder
Yeah.
to do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and in my case, those are variables I never control because I don't roast coffee. And I never really went extremely deep in the rabbit hole of the physics of roasting, for example. I did read up a little bit about it, but my understanding is very limited. So I'm really much more of a consumer of roasts. And all I can say is, oh, the roast from this place or that machine behave differently from these other roasts. So they're not variables I actively control, but I can tell that they have a really strong impact on both the taste and all of the more objective measurements like extraction yield, for example. And there are definitely different types of machines like Lohrings, which are fluidized bed machines that really seem to behave differently because the heat is carried to the bean with different mechanisms, basically.
Yeah, and so it's, as we've talked with a lot of people on the show through the Rate of Rise series, which is a roasting focused series. That is the through line of so many people's recommendations is getting to know your equipment, observing, plotting, tracking, becoming just aware of the dimensions of your vehicle, if you will, so that you can park that thing anywhere, really. And so it seems similar in your own pursuit of consistency and in predictability.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's really about having a methodology and being aware of what you're doing. So instead of just doing everything different each time, for example, if you brew pour over coffee, just be aware of what your hands are doing and pay attention and try to always do the same. And then once you always do the same exactly, you can try to understand what different variables can do to your coffee. So if you change your kettle temperature, you will realize that it has an impact on taste. But if you also change your grind size, or if you turned on the motor of your grinder before you poured the coffee one time and the other time you did the reverse, you put the coffee first and turned on the motor. If you did a different preparation of your coffee bed, used a different paper filter, you won't be able necessarily to tell exactly what effect that changing the brew temperature had on your brew. So it's super important to be methodical, basically. And from what I gather, from what Scott is teaching with roasting, for example, it's really the same. It's about repeating the same things every time. And with roasting, it seems even harder because you're dealing with giant machines that heat up over time, that are sensitive to the room temperature and things like that. So I suspect that you have to be even more OCD in the case of roasting to really achieve repeatable results.
Yeah, and even different roasters will produce different versions of the same blend depending on the time of the year it is. If you're drawing in freezing cold air versus hot air in the seasons changing, and the person at the other end, yourself and me, will be thinking we know all the rules about this particular blend, but then all of a sudden there's something that's a little bit different.
In most cases, I start with each bag of coffee that I get from even the same roaster and the same bean. I always assume it might behave differently. So if I want, for example, to run an experiment and see how grind size affects the flow in espresso, I will not buy two different batches of coffee from the same roaster to use across this experiment, because it might change drastically just because there was something different happening that day at the roastery. So I always make sure to run a given experiment with a single batch of roasted coffee. And that's just to point out the fact that even well-intended roasters that are careful, if they roast the same coffee twice, it can behave slightly different when you brew it.
Wow. It makes a lot of sense, and it sounds pretty frustrating also, for those of us who are trying to get a lot of predictability. And we'd like to think that nothing changes from batch to batch, but obviously it does. But I imagine there are rules that you can come up with for coffee that apply in a macro sense, but might not yield the exact results every time, but they yield good results.
Yeah, so for example, if your coffee comes out with a different moisture content, it might be more brittle or less brittle. Typically, if there's more moisture, the bean will be less brittle, more ductile. And if you cut that bean, you will generate less powder or less coffee fines. Whereas if it's drier and more brittle, it will kind of explode as you cut it and generate a lot more powder. So with the same grinder, the same burrs, your coffee might generate a different ratio of powder when you grind it.
That's really interesting. I get that a lot with decaf because it tends to, it seems to produce a lot more fines, and I always take that into account. And maybe other coffees, depending on their roast level, especially darker roasted coffees, can produce more fines as well.
Yeah, and I've only started really exploring the impact of fines because it's actually very hard to measure this. So I've developed an app when I first started diving really deep into this that allows you to take pictures of your ground coffee on a white sheet, or better on a scanner, for example. and analyze the particle size distribution, so how many particles you have of each different size. But it's extremely hard to measure how many fines you have with that technique. Fines in coffee are usually about 20 to 100 microns in size. And that's approximately the size of the cells in the coffee bean. So it's not just a coincidence that they are of the same size. It's related to the fact that if you crush a coffee bean, you get fractures that propagate along the coffee bean. And these fractures propagate to smaller and smaller sizes until they hit the size of an individual cell in the coffee. And it cannot propagate smaller because the cells are like these square empty pockets, and you generate a lot of fines that are of approximately the same size of a cell for that reason. But all of this is to say that those are way too small to be imaged in an easy way. Even if you were using a microscope and you were extremely careful, they tend to stick to the larger particles. It's just really a mess to measure the fines, except if you have access to a laser diffraction machine. Those are machines that will use a pulse of air and shoot some air on your sample of coffee to really get the fines to separate from the larger coffee particles. And as they are moving, as they are pushed away by this pulse of air, there's a laser that is shining through the particle, the amount of light that you are receiving on the other end, and you can actually get a very good measurement of how many fines you have in this way. The problem is that these machines are extremely expensive. So we are just starting to have some data about this by people that provided us with measurements, like Douglas Weber sent me some laser data recently. And one thing that we immediately saw in these kinds of data was that decaf indeed produces a lot more fines, but interestingly, the fines might be slightly different in size in the case of decaf. And a similar thing happens with Ethiopians as well as dark roast. When I say Ethiopians, it's some specific varieties that tend to grow in Ethiopia, not all of them. But it's often very hard to know which variety of coffee you are getting from Ethiopia. They are often just blended together at the washing station. So in my experience, when you get an Ethiopian bean of coffee, you have a high risk that it will produce a lot of fines, but it doesn't always happen. And when you pull a shot of espresso, you might need to grind it a lot coarser. Whereas if you use decaf, it's almost certain that you will need to grind it a lot coarser because of all these extra fines.
Oh, it's really interesting. I'm just thinking back to my own career, and pour-overs of Ethiopian coffees have always had the risk of choking versus other coffees, and perhaps that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you have to be much more careful in how you agitate them. If you're too aggressive in agitating them, the fines can reach the bottom of the coffee bed and clog the paper filter. And some drippers are more prone to clogging than others. Kalita, for example, while it can make great brews, the paper filter is not always lifted very efficiently by the ridges at the bottom. The paper filter, when it's wet, can actually collapse on top of the small 3 holes at the bottom of the dripper. And when that happens, all of the water has to flow through a tiny surface area of paper. And it becomes extremely easy to clog the brews when this happens. And in that specific case, there is a quick life hack that can really help. You can cut out a circle in a pasta strainer, for example, or any kind of coarse mesh, and just insert it at the bottom of the Kalita dripper. You can do the same with this Fellow stag. I got very good results with this. And this ensures that the water will be able to pass through the hole of the bottom, and it will make it much harder to clog.
Really interesting. Love those life hacks. And I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times that I've been quote unquote aggressively agitated myself by choking brews. But I'm curious now that we're, talking a little bit about, experience in the cafe setting. When we're talking about experimenting in homes and in home brewing, there's a proliferation of little doodads and tools that we've got.
Oh, yeah.
Things that are relatively, I'd say, impractical for the kind of coffee bar that's making anywhere from 3 to 5 to 800 cups of coffee a day. But I'm curious in terms of what you've learned through your blogging and now publishing this book. What are the main things that you see are the most important, especially for operators of commercial coffee businesses, to achieve consistency and just a high level of quality in that consistency?
Yeah, there are a few things that can be easily done in a coffee shop, but not all of them. So it's definitely true that all of the tools that we use, for example, for puck preparation and espresso, a lot of them would not be practical at all in a coffee shop. In my case, when I really do all of the steps carefully, it can take me a minute or two to prepare a puck of espresso, which really is not practical in a cafe environment. But there are variables that are easier to keep always the same. And in the context of espresso, especially, the dose is super important. So grinding by weight, for example, weighing the portafilter as the grinds fall in the portafilter is super important, because changing this will not only change the strength of the cup, but also the optimum grind size for it to be dialed in. So if you dial in the morning with 18 grams and then you pull a shot is going to grind finer for the next shot, and then you can kind of chase your dial in if you're not careful about measuring your dose. It's not always convenient to just weigh the portafilter before and after grinding, but if you just get a grinder that allows you to grind by weight, or just place a scale strategically under the grinder, I'm sure there are ways to make this super efficient. And then controlling the ratio when you brew espresso is extremely important. So always try to pull the same amount of water through your coffee. And in the case of pour over, trying to keep the same brand of paper filters might sound crazy, but there are different brands of paper filters that will flow very differently. So trying to keep them always the same, to always have the same temperature when you brew. When brewing batch brews, it's super important to ensure that the whole bed of coffee is wet during the pre-infusion. If it's not efficiently pre-wet, you might get some dry spots where the water won't flow as well, and you might get some bad taste and less repeatability from it.
How do you test that?
That's actually pretty hard to test easily, but one way that I can tell if a batch brew was not evenly wet is to just take the basket out as soon as it is over and try to see if you can spot some bubbles coming up to the surface. At the end of a batch brew, you should really not be seeing bubbles of degassing. If that is happening, it means that you had some pretty bad dry spots in your brew. If you want to really test it in more details and are willing to make one less good batch, you might pull the basket during the brew and inspect for bubbles. And in my experience, most batch brewing machines are really not great at this. It's really unfortunate. I've gotten some very good results at the office using a ratio 6, but I had to aggressively agitate it with a stick. And the part that is really fortunate about this machine is that you can access the basket while it's brewing. So I use these wooden sticks that come with the siphons, and I just agitate it very well during the bloom. And I can feel when I put the stick in the bed during the bloom that there are some dry spots where I can feel some resistance. And I really just agitate it until I can feel no more resistance. And the nice thing about batch brews is that you are grinding very coarse, and you typically have a lot less fines that might clog the filter. So you can be a lot more aggressive with the agitation. And I found some way better results by aggressively agitating the bloom with batch brews. And I really wish there was a machine that would like systematically stir the coffee while it's brewing for batch brews.
I believe that's part of the principle, and they're a sponsor of this show, but Ground Control has the multiple infusions, and also agitation is part of the extraction process there.
Yeah, I never tried these, but it sounds like a really good idea, actually.
Yeah. And maybe about 15 longer years ago, there was a place, I don't think it's around in New York City anymore. It was called, I think, Jack's Stir Brewed Coffee. And it had these, really ugly brewers. Sorry, anybody who is affiliated with them, but they would stir the coffee while it brewed on the top, and that was the whole concept of this equipment. And so it's interesting how there is a limited number of tools that kind of we cycle through in methodologies, and once we have a better understanding of them, these iterations of methods start to become a little bit more accepted across the board, and then more people can be creative with how we apply them. Like you might spend 2 minutes with your home espresso, but maybe the methodologies that you're using to make great espresso at home will be commercialized by a company that makes it easy to produce the same results because of your experiments.
Yeah. And are you speaking about the Clover machine?
No, but that's maybe different. A good example also.
Yeah. So I was thinking of that because if I recall correctly, I've never actually seen one in person, but I've seen videos of people brewing with these, and they would also stir from the top while it's brewing. And I'm not surprised at all that they had this really good reputation for taste, because it's much harder to get dry spots with this concept. So yeah, I think it's just agitation in the case of batch brew is super important.
One thing that you mentioned to me before we were recording, specifically about batch brewing, which I thought was interesting, was a kind of a mindset shift about what batch brewers are actually used for. And your idea was that batch brewers are not really meant to be time savers per se. And so I'm curious about how you think we should approach batch brewing, because it seems like we just want to cram as much coffee into there as possible and let it sit, so we don't have to think about it. It's hot, it's there, we'll pull from the tap and that's it. But maybe we're using it the wrong way, and I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure they became very popular because they're more time efficient. Brewing several pour overs for each different customer is really impractical. But the thing is that you can get actually a really good tasting coffee with batch brew. And it's just about making sure that you don't have dry spots, making sure that the dispersion of water on top of the coffee is wide enough that you're not just spreading water on the center of the coffee, and grinding coarse enough, and making sure that you have the right ratio, and also that you don't let the coffee in the pot for more than about half an hour or 30 minutes. If you follow all of these steps, in my experience, the coffee can be as good, if not better, than brewing individual V60s. So it's really not just about being more time efficient. You can actually make really good coffee with batch brews. But it's sometimes hard to convince let's say the coffee aficionados that would come as customers. They might think that batch brews are always worse in principle. And I used to think that, just because of my experience in drinking batch brews that would have been sitting there for too long, or that were brewed with probably dry spots in the coffee bed. So if you really make sure to be systematic and get a good quality of extraction with a batch brewer, it can be really good. And I think it would be worth that coffee shops try to help customers understanding that. And I don't know how that could be done, but maybe offer a free shooter of batch brew when a customer orders a V60 so that they can see that it's actually better.
Yeah. I mean, in
That
step one
that
would
could
be
be one.
actually making it better instead of just
Oh
kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
schlumping it over into the corner and forgetting to clean it. And, you know,
absolutely.
there's all sorts of crazy stuff that happens with batch brewers. But so some
Hmm.
of the
Yeah.
reputation is earned
Oh
by
yeah.
our own fault. But when I
Hmm.
hear you talking about this, it's like, yes, we absolutely can create these great brews off of batch brewers.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we have built an expectation in the workflow that batch brew will last a certain amount of time. So switching it out every 30 minutes to some people are like, are you nuts? No way. Like we hold it for 30 minutes or 3 hours. You just added a
Yeah.
zero in that. But when you do that, when you brew that much coffee at once, and I hear you talking about saturation of the grounds, it makes me think that
Hmm.
maybe we need to go in the direction of not going above certain amount of coffee in these baskets because
Yeah.
the bed depth is just too deep to actually get a good extraction. What's your experience with that?
Exactly. That is actually exactly right. So, with the example of the ratio, which I've used a lot, so it's made the water tank is large enough that you can brew anywhere between 30 grams at the smallest to be 80, 90 grams of coffee. And I've always done 50 grams with it. And if I do any more than 50 grams, I find it really hard to get a good saturation of the coffee bed. And that's in part related to the deeper bed. So when, as you mentioned, the bed becomes too deep, it takes a lot more time for the water to reach the lower layers. But also, some machines don't dispense enough water during the pre-infusion step. So you want to be sure that you use at least twice the weight of the dose for your pre-infusion, and ideally 3 times the weight. I found is a sweet spot. So if you have a 50 grams dose, it's better to have about 150 grams of water that is dispensed, and then you wait a little, usually something like 30 seconds, but you can get really good results with longer blooms. You can do even 2 minutes. If you can afford that time, it can really help extraction, especially with light roasts. And making sure that you stir it can be really useful if that's a possibility. But yeah, if your coffee bed is starting to be deeper than 4 or 5 centimeters, it might really become a problem. And another way of stating that is that if you have wider baskets, your machine is optimized for larger doses. Whereas if you have narrower baskets, you might be better off making smaller doses.
So it probably would be in our best interest because we're always concerned about throwing coffee out, for one thing. We can always
Mm-hmm.
brew half batches. A lot of machines have
Yeah.
the capability of doing that. Increasingly, manufacturers are allowing you to control more of what you can do in these machines,
Yeah.
and just manage the expectation of the staff to say that it's a shorter window of hold time, but a more frequent
Mm-hmm.
brew with less coffee equals better coffee generally.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yes.
Okay, so talk a little bit about freshness on that note, because the reaction that coffee has to the hot water, of course, the bloom phase and what can be extracted or not be extracted during that phase is quite different. Maybe at home and commercially, because we always in the shop you end up with this crisis on your hands where we're out of coffee, so we have to open like a fresh bag, and we all cringe because now the bloom is going to overflow the basket and the get grounds and the
Mm.
coffee urns. I'm wondering what your experience is with freshness and how you've seen that impact coffee quality, or maybe some rules that we should follow when it's time to optimize a brew.
Yeah. So when I was more, I would say, innocent about all of the concepts of physics and coffee, I used to think that fresher is always better. But there are definitely scenarios where it's too fresh and it's degassing a lot. And especially if you're pulling espresso shots, But even with cupping, you can really get a worse extraction if your roast is too fresh. And there are some rules that can be useful for keeping coffee fresh that surprised me at first. So one of the important aspects of coffee aging is the roast level. So the darker a coffee is roasting, the more quickly it will age. And that is at least in part related to the fact that the pores between the individual cells in a coffee bean get enlarged when a roast is darker. And that will allow not only the degassing to happen a bit faster, it will make it also easier for the oil inside the coffee beans to reach the surface. So the oil inside the bean will always eventually reach the surface, but in a light roast, it might take 2 weeks. And with a super dark roast, it might take a few minutes after roasting. So once the oil has reached the surface, then it can really easily contact oxygen if you open the bag. And oxygen plus oil will create a rancid taste pretty fast. So there's the oils, but there's also the degassing of not only CO2, but all of the nice aromas in the coffee. With a darker roast, they will all leave the bean much faster. So if you leave a bean exposed to air, a darker roast will get bad way faster than a light roast. But if you keep the bag closed, it can really preserve the coffee for a while, because initially it will degas a lot of CO2 and aromas, and this will create some kind of a shield inside of the bag of coffee. And the one-way valve will be useful because it will push some of the air and some of the oxygen out as the beans are degassing. And you're really creating a protective barrier inside of the bag because of that. So one of the things that surprised me most about coffee aging is back a few years ago with friends, we did a cupping where we tried to blindly identify bags that were aged differently. And we were all unable to tell apart two bags, one of which was fresh, something around 2 weeks fresh, and the other one was 3 months old, but the bag had never been opened. And it was a relatively light roast. So at first that really surprised me, because I would have thought that a 3-month-old bag would be immediately bad. But what happens is that the CO2 inside the bag protected it for a while. One important thing to keep in mind, however, is if you open a 3-month-old bag, you will get rid of all the CO2 that was in this bag. And there might be not much more CO2 left in the beans. So starting at that moment, the beans might taste good, but they are also much more fragile starting from this point. And any oxygen you are introducing in the bag might stay there and start damaging the beans much faster. So being mindful of when you open the bags and how often you open them is really critical for coffee aging. And one directly applicable rule I would tell people to try to follow is that if they open a very large bag of coffee that you don't think you will be using within a couple of weeks, maybe a week or two, it is worth separating it in 2 or 3 smaller bags immediately so that you don't open and close the bag as many times. So you might open and close the first bag a lot of times during the first 2 weeks as you drink it, but then the other 2 bags that you already split have not seen oxygen that often, and they have not lost all of their CO2 many times. So separating in appropriately sized bags is super important. And one part that is probably very hard to deal with is very dark roasts. So I have often had espressos in coffee shops that tasted very rancid, and they tend to be the darker roasted beans. And the problem is that if you leave them in a hopper for several days, they will undoubtedly become rancid, and they are definitely much harder to deal with.
Not only that, but then, if you leave the coffee in the hopper overnight without putting it back into a bag, there's broken pieces of coffee right at the spout where the burrs are. They're not all the way ground, but they're still older. So, I mean, there's all sorts of different dynamics happening in the hopper there. And for a lot of us, I don't think a lot of people will use coffee that has oils on the surface and it's in their hopper, but for a lot of people, it's just, oil free, at least more so these days in a more like third wave oriented coffee culture. But in terms of when you say a large bag of coffee, I think 5-pound bags of coffee. And maybe that's not what you were intending, but the dynamics of the way a bar works is you go through a 5-pound bag. You could go through a 5-pound bag in a day. And so there's always this debate about how long to age your espresso. And, should you do that with the bag open? Should you do that with the bag closed? I personally have, made the mistake as a competitor in the past where I opened my competition coffee right before putting it in the hopper and getting on stage. And the CO2 was very much present still, but it was well aged at the same time. So I'm curious, what kind of best practice do you think would be good for a commercial environment in terms of aging coffee?
Yeah, so it's definitely fine if you're going to use a bag of 5 pounds to not separate it in smaller bags if you're going to use it all in one day. So it's all about having the right size of bag for how fast you're going to use it. However, aging the coffee appropriately is a bit more challenging because if you put a coffee that is fresh out of the roaster in a bag and let it age there, it will degas up to a point when the pressure builds up in the bag and it starts puffing. It will degas more slowly starting at this point. So one thing that you might want to do if you roast your own coffee is always age it a set amount of time before you bag it. That could be a good practice. And then waiting for the bag to be maybe 2 weeks old for espresso. So that could be a way to achieve very repeatable results. And once you open the bag, you might not have too much changing during the day. Whereas if you package the beans when they're extremely fresh, you might maybe see more variation after you open the bag because they will keep degassing all of the gas that they could not degas because the bag had built up too much pressure. So I think having a fixed method would be good.
It feels like the holy grail for coffee bars to achieve the consistency of their espresso, where we're always dealing with different roast dates. And if there was a bar out there, I don't know if you exist, if you're listening, you should email me, where you're always dealing with the exact same roast date. And I'm not talking about right after roasting, like aging. We always use only 2-week-old espresso. That would be amazing. And your inventory and systems must be amazing as well. It gives us something to shoot for.
And some coffees need more resting than others, which makes things even more complicated.
Now, one of my final questions here as we wrap up, I think, is so far we're talking about better. We're talking about achieving better results in coffee. How we go about determining what those better results are. One, going back to the beginning of the conversation, when you found that most of the stuff that we come up with in coffee is based on subjective experience. So it's all anecdotal. What tools are there out there that you've experienced that actually live up to the hype in terms of being able to show you that your coffee actually is legitimately better?
Oh, yeah, sure. There are tools such as the VST refractometer that allow you to measure the concentration of a brew. And from the concentration and the dose that you use and the weight of your brew, you can work back the fraction of solubles that you extracted from the beans. And this tool is extremely useful for repeatability and trying to understand what is happening in your brew. It is not necessarily true to say that the number will tell you if your brew is good or not. In some cases, you can get a hint from the number, but it's extremely useful to know whether you are able to repeat always the same thing, for example. Now, I wouldn't suggest that coffee shops refract most of their brews. That's not practical, but maybe once every day you refract one and see if you have wild variations. Then you might start wondering what might be causing these. And that's definitely one of the most useful diagnostic tools that I know of. But in terms of making the brews more consistent, there are also other tools that are very useful, like for puck preparation. Which temper you're using can have an impact. And there are also tools that are useful for the home brewers that are not very practical in a coffee shop. Like you might have heard of the Weiss distribution technique, this thing with needles that you use to shake a puck of coffee. It's definitely useful if you have the time, but it's not very practical for a coffee shop.
Right. And so the refractometer would be something that you could use for espresso and filter.
Yes, definitely. Yes. And with the specific goal of diagnosing whether something happened with respect to your grinder or something else like that. Another tool I could think of would be measuring the content of your water if you are using tap water, because tap water can have seasonal changes, or something can happen with your in the pipes of your city that cause a change. So one quick thing that is very useful is a electric conductivity meter. It only tells you an approximation of how much minerals you have in your water in ppm. And that will not tell you directly whether you have a lot of bicarb or not in your water, which is super important for coffee. But it will be a useful number to look at to verify whether your water has changed. So if every day you are measuring let's say 120 ppm, and then in the summer it starts getting higher and higher, then you might start getting into more detailed measurements with your water. You can get some aquarium testing kits that will allow you to measure the bicarbonate content directly in your water. And if you see that your TDS is changing, now you can go use an aquarium kit maybe and check whether your bicarb level has changed, has increased, which might be worrisome. So that's definitely another tool that I would keep in mind.
Is there a number for bicarb that is kind of like the rule that you go by for your own taste, I guess?
There's a number for me. I prefer around 40 ppm as CaCO3. That is a weird unit of measurement. You can translate the aquarium tests from degrees of German hardness to ppm at CaCO3. I'll just use ppm for short, but I prefer 40 ppm. For example, what Regalia does is not the lightest roast out there, but they're relatively light. And with these types of coffees, I like 40 ppm. With some darker roasts, you might want to lower a little bit, maybe 20 ppm. But there is also a taste preference. So some people like very low ppms, but I'm not aware of anyone really liking, let's say, something harder than 60 ppm in terms of bicarb. So something between 20 and 60 would be a relatively widely accepted range.
That's great. This has really been hugely informative. And of course, there's far more detail in the book and on your Instagram account and your blog. And I encourage everybody to go out there and buy the book and also interact with what you've written online about this stuff.
Thanks.
And, thinking about all of the complexities of making great coffee, we want to kind of apply the same kind of rigor in the way that we approach our daily work in coffee. What can the average non-astrophysicist like myself and, and most people do in their own kitchens or cafes, like even just starting this week, to make better decisions about how they make coffee?
I would recommend first focusing on repeating always the same method that you use, and identify what might introduce variations in your brews. If you can set always the same temperature in your kettle, always grind the same way, turn on the motor before you grind if that's what you prefer, but don't alternate. Don't sometimes turn it before or after. And pay attention to your water is one of the most important things I would recommend. Buy a cheap aquarium kit and test your water just to know where you land approximately. And I think those would be the things I would recommend focusing on at first.
Excellent. Oh, well, Jonathan, it's been wonderful to have you. Where can we go to buy that book and interact with your work?
Awesome. You can follow my Instagram on Gagné Astro Coffee, or just type my name and coffee. And you can go on Scott Rao's website to buy my book. He's actually in charge of distribution, and it ships everywhere in the world, mostly. So that's where you can find my work.
Excellent. Thank you so much once again. Really glad to have you in the industry.
Thanks again. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. Consistency and tracking what you do, of course, again, kind of a common refrain from so many of the experts that we bring on here, and really applying ourselves to looking into all that happens at each stage of the brewing process and getting a really good understanding of what's happening can help us refine our tools and practices at every stage. This is what Jonathan has been doing with coffee. It's what we can do with coffee as well. And of course, if you are interested in more information about the physics of filter coffee and applying it to what you do in your coffee shop, you can buy his book, The Physics of Filter Coffee. You can buy that book right now by going over to the website scottrao.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Jonathan's blog, Coffee Ad Astra, and of course, follow Jonathan on Instagram. The handle there is at @JGagnéAstroCoffee. And of course, we're going to have the links for all of these in the show notes. And a huge thank you to Jonathan for joining us on the show. We so appreciate your work in coffee and joining us today at Keys to the Shop to share about your journey and help us be more successful with what we do in the coffee industry. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback from me about today's episode or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, definitely send me an email, chris@keystotheshop.com. It's also where you can reach out to inquire about Keys to the Shop consulting, chris@keystotheshop.com. And I would mention also that, in the show notes, we list recommended episodes to listen to that are related to the one that you just listened to. Of course, I'm going to link to a few great ones in this one of which will be a conversation with Scott Rao and a couple of other brewing and roasting focused ones. So you should keep the conversation going by listening to those episodes the next time you listen to Keys to the Shop. So one of the things that helps us really thrive in the coffee industry is the kind of wisdom that is accumulated through experimentation, like we just saw in today's episode. That's true for coffee science. That's also true for entrepreneurship and running coffee bars and working in coffee. And you can have access to that kind of information in spades when you attend Coffee Fest trade shows. Coffee Fest has been delivering what I feel is one of the most valuable and important resources for the coffee industry, especially for coffee retailers in the world. Now, I've been doing Coffee Fest since 2004 as a judge, presenter, competitor, and it just keeps getting better, folks. I mean, I really think that you need to check them out at coffeefest.com. They're going to Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle. Those are the remaining shows for 2022. You can get 50% off your registration by using the code KEYS when you register yourself and your team. There's free and accessibly priced lectures, trainings, and workshops, some of which I will be conducting, as well as the trade show floor where you get to interact with awesome vendors. There's a cold brew competition, latte art competition, the amazing community that you get to hang out with, like-minded professionals that are there because they want to run a great coffee shop. It's super invigorating for your team. It's hugely equipping for you to run a great coffee shop, so you can't lose here. So again, for more information and to register today, check them out over at coffeefest.com. I really hope to see you there. Again, register today at coffeefest.com. And with that, that is the end of our show today, everybody. Thank you so much. It was really fun to learn about the physics of filter coffee with you and with our guest, Jonathan Gagné. I really appreciate your time. Have a great day. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.